Hello my friends, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh, coming to you in wonderful stereophonic super quality audio. Now during this strange time of international lockdown, I'm going to be helping to keep you busy by sharing some thoughts on what I've been reading in the past few weeks. Now I'm only going to discuss 4 books today because I have a little more than usual to say about them, and I don't want to inflict an incredibly long video on you guys. We're going to start with a very famous book, She, A History of Adventure by H. Rider Haggard, which was written in 1886 and first published as a novel about a year later. Of course, this features the deathless Queen Aisha, she who must be obeyed, a character probably most closely associated by members of my generation with Ursula Andress and Hammer Studios' 1965 film version with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Now, I first read this book many years ago because I was aware of its massive influence on fantastical literature, and because at the time I was just beginning my lifelong love affair with the classics. Unfortunately, I found it boring and stodgy, really stodgy. So it was only because I've begun writing a novel myself that set in lost civilizations and wanted to make reference to it that I picked it up again and gave it another go. And I find myself with a better opinion of it now, but I still think it has major flaws. For those not familiar with the story, it's narrated by an academic named Holly who has agreed to raise the son of a late friend and deliver a sealed iron box to the lad on his 25th birthday that contains his inheritance. Now this turns out to be a series of artifacts that seem to confirm his dead father's wild tales of a lost African civilization ruled by an immortal white woman. The various inscriptions on these artifacts, some of which are quite lengthy, are supplied not only in English but also in unsealed Greek, cursive Greek, medieval Latin, an Old English black letter translation of the Latin, a modernised version of this black letter translation, together with, quote, an expanded version for the benefit of those who find the contractions troublesome. Not surprisingly, I found all of that quite troublesome, really, as I think most modern readers might. I mean, applause to Haggard for his scholastic endeavours and attempts at authenticity, but not so much for his ability to entertain. Now, these early chapters seem to confirm my worst fears about tackling this novel again, but to be fair, things pick up considerably when our heroes start out on their journey, eventually arriving at the lost city of Kor, which is located deep inside an unexplored African volcano. Now, we're approaching the halfway point of the tale by then, and it's all okay, but here's where it comes to a shuddering halt. Very little plot remains before our heroes and she take their fateful trip to the Chamber of the Eternal Flame in the final chapters. Really, it's mostly just a guided tour of Kor, which is in essence just one large graveyard. This still could have been interesting if not for one thing. Now, Haggard has created a fascinating character with Aisha. Her age has given her the wisdom of centuries, and she's willful, wise and complicated, neither hero nor villain. Her deeds have no real basis in a moral code that we understand, and Haggard conveys that very effectively indeed. But here's the thing. She likes to talk. In fact, she pretty much never shuts up. Now, sorry if that sounds a bit sexist, but when you give your main character an almost endless series of lengthy speeches, then I think you're inviting an accusation of verbal diarrhea. Particularly if you make her deliver one that's 665 words long without any interruptions right at the climax of the action. There are some good things about this novel, and I certainly enjoyed it much more the second time around, but I still found it a hard slog, and I'm someone who enjoys a lot of literature from that period. Aisha, The Return of She, a sequel, followed in 1905, and there were 2 further novels, but from what I gather these detail events that occurred before the main narrative of this original work. But more on those after I've read them, because yep, I'm still going to do that. One of my other great literary passions is hardball crime, and it's a trio of those I'm going to talk about now, beginning with I Spit on Your Graves by Vernon Lawrence. A book just as remarkable for the story about its creation and the aftermath of its publication than for its contents. Because this book caused a sensation when it was published in France in 1946 and was an almost immediate bestseller. It was a translation by Boris Vian of a novel written by an American black author called Vernon Lawrence, which was deemed far too scandalous to touch with a 10-foot pole by US publishers. The story concerns a young black man who can pass for white and the revenge he takes on small-town USA. He arrives in this small town to take up a job running the high street bookstore and quickly worms his way into the local social scene, specifically associating with a group of privileged young teenagers who hang out at the malt shop. Pretty soon he's having sex with all the girls and using them to step up into what passes for local high society, where there he can put his revenge into full effect. So why was this so controversial? Well, leaving aside the race angle, the book is told in the first person by our very questionable protagonist, and he speaks in a dispassionate and almost humorous voice. Certainly he seems to be having fun, although there's an undercurrent of rage always present. The motive behind his actions is the recent lynching of his brother, but that took place in a neighbouring town, and none of his targets were the least bit involved in that tragedy. His revenge is against society, not against specific individuals. Now that might be a little unsettling on its own, but there's far worse to come. The kids hanging out at the local malt shop are just that, kids, 15 or 16 years of age, and remember he's having sex with all the girls. In one later chapter, he and one of the town's favourite sons visit two black prostitutes who are even younger, about 12 years old, and yes, they have sex with them. Now, if that wasn't enough, later on he commits a couple of gruesome sex murders, which are the most graphic and disturbing killings that I've ever encountered in print. Now, I'm pretty sure all this would raise a few eyebrows now, but this book, remember, was published in 1946. And as I said, it was an almost instant bestseller, shifting millions of copies in France. But obviously it didn't go down well with the guardians of the public morals. And for once, their outrage is, to some extent, understandable, especially given the era. Legal action followed and the book was banned outright in 1949, at which point translator Vian had to come clean. There was no American author called Vernon Lawrence. He'd written the book himself during a fortnight family holiday. What fun that must have been. It was the result of a bet with his wife and his publisher that he could knock out a bestseller in a couple of weeks. And he won that bet, of course, but it cost him a fine of 10,000 francs in a French court, which is worth, I think, about $500 today, but don't quote me on that. Words are my thing, not figures. Worse for Vian, though, was that he had to spend the rest of his life trying to live the whole business down. You see, despite writing further books in the same vein for financial reasons early in his career, later on he became a very serious and respected writer in highfalutin literary circles. But of course the public always associated his name with this book, and he could never escape from its shadow. In fact, he said that writing it became the biggest regret of his life. So after all that, what's it like? Well, Vian's prose is very stripped down, modern and readable. His protagonist is the kind of character you'll be familiar with if you've read a lot of more recent crime fiction, particularly about serial killers. And so I found the first half of the novel intriguing and darkly entertaining. However, this pretty short story begins to run out of steam very quickly, and there's little plot development beyond the actual killings, which are incredibly unpleasant and not for the squeamish. Worse, it becomes only too obvious that Vian either didn't know how to end his tale or simply ran out of time when he was writing it. The last few chapters switched to a third-person narration and are hopelessly rushed, and more than a little amateurish, I'm afraid to say. Would I recommend it? Not really, unless the story behind the story piques your interest, because in a way that's much better than the book itself, although it's undoubtedly important from a historical perspective. But if you do take it on, be warned, those sex murders are likely to turn your stomach. They did mine. Talking of not being 100% politically correct, we're going to finish with two related novels by the enfant terrible of noir fiction, Mickey Spillane. Yes, I know Spillane's work is not without its issues, and I don't think the two of us would have been good drinking buddies, but I'm always captured by his swift, stylish and dynamic prose. He wastes no words, and that makes his work effortlessly readable. In the late 1960s, Spillane was already a famous man, not only having delivered private detective Mike Hammer to the public, but also playing him in a movie called The Girl Hunters. He'd also delivered a quartet of novels featuring commie-bashing spy Tiger Man, but he felt it was time to launch a new character in a new series of novels, and this was to be Morgan the Raider, and the novel was to be The Delta Factor. Now, as a special agent behind enemy lines during the war, Morgan has carried out many a successful black operation, but when a $14 million heist is performed during peacetime using his exact methods, then he is inevitably tapped for the crime and eventually arrested. The irony is, of course, that he didn't do it and he's got no idea where the missing millions are. But the government offer him a deal: time off a long jail sentence if he can liberate an imprisoned scientist from an unfriendly Latin American country. Now, of course, Morgan is a typical Spillane anti-hero. He's misogynistic, yet irresistible to the ladies, and not shy about using his fists or a gun. But he is far more intelligent than Mike Hammer, whose investigative technique was simply to go around and beat people up until he found out what he needed to know. Also, Morgan is no super patriot like Tiger Man. He's only playing the angles for himself. The fact that his interests coincide with the US government is merely a temporary inconvenience. Now, this is a fast-paced and enjoyable novel, even if I felt it lacked a little of the personality of some of his better work. But if you're a fan, you'll undoubtedly get a pretty big kick out of it. Now, its original publication came with a certain amount of press ballyhoo. An Italian feature film was announced. Spillane was involved with that production, and it starred Christopher George and Yvette Mimieux, who were not top-of-the-range stars by any means, but certainly names that were familiar to US audiences of the time. Unfortunately, the film flopped. I did watch it myself a while back, and I have to confess it's one of those movies that I could recall almost nothing about a couple of weeks after seeing it. It's just a real non-event. Now, when the feature film flopped, Spillane lost heart and confidence in the character and abandoned his sequel, The Consummata, although it was apparently mostly completed, and never featured the character again. When he died in 2006, Spillane left his entire literary estate, including many unfinished manuscripts, to a young writer called Max Allan Collins, who he had befriended. Now, Collins has spent the last decade and a half completing this unfinished work, as well as producing his own novels. So it is that The Consummata finally hit bookstores in 2011. Now, I had an open mind going into this one because, of course, I was prepared to be disappointed. I was unfamiliar with Collins' work, and if there had been any great merit to the novel, would Spillane have abandoned it? Well, all I can say is that I think it was a bad decision that he did, because I actually think that it's better than The Delta Factor, and I enjoyed it more. I think it has a better plot, and the main character is more well-rounded and engaging. Now, how much this is down to Collins' contribution, of course, I don't know, but the greatest compliment I can give him is that I can't tell where Spillane ends and he begins. Collins has captured the late author's style perfectly and delivered a seamless, page-turning adventure that I was always happy to return to at the end of the day. Well, that's it for this video. I'll be posting more book reviews in the coming weeks. Perhaps I won't go into as much depth about some of the titles, but I felt that these had some interesting aspects that I wanted to share with you. So, until the next time, stay safe, stay well, and probably best to stay indoors. And of course, don't be a stranger.